What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and this is a barrel-aged edition of Homebrewed Christianity. That's right, we've been putting out podcasts for over 12 years, and the thing is, I can only have 100 of them on the iTunes and most podcast app feeds at any one time. That means that new listeners, new deacons of Homebrewed Christianity will be without some of the greatest conversations I've had with legendary scholars of religion and philosophy. And today, we are joined by Douglas John Hall, Canada's greatest living theologian, emeritus professor of theology at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. He is a theologian of the cross, a contextual theologian, and wonderfully articulate with one sweet, sweet accent. This episode was recorded and released in 2014, where we were discussing two of his books, What Christianity Is Not and Waiting for the Gospel. But over the course of this conversation, you hear about not only his own theological reflection, his love for music, some of his personal story, but interactions with people like Jürgen Moltmann, Billy Graham, and his teachers, Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, and being a student at that, kind of like legendary time for American theology in the late 20th century at Union Theological Seminary. I hope you dig this episode, and I just got to give a shout out to the Homebrewed Christianity members who were discussing episodes no longer available. I didn't realize this one wasn't. It was so good, it just stayed in my head. You know, it's kind of like Douglas John Hall has just been in my head, and I assumed it was still available. So thanks for reminding me. And if there are episodes you want re-released, let me know. Last thing, if you are a Homebrewed Christianity community member, make sure you check your feed. What feed, you might say? Well, haven't you installed on your podcast listening device the private Homebrewed Christianity feed? You know, where all the community goodness gets delivered right to your phone, like the 5-lecture Introduction to the Hebrew Bible by Walter Brueggemann I gave you all for Christmas, or the lectures and Q&A sessions from the Called to Be Prophets conference with Robin Henderson Espinosa, Brian McLaren, and Steve Davidson that just went in. If you haven't, then email me or check your email so you can get access to that feed. And if you haven't joined the community, I would love for you to do it. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com. This is a listener-supported endeavor. It takes basically about 20 hours or so in a week to do between everything. Things I do. Sometimes I pay other people to do it, but it's a lot of work and such. So if you want to support that, help a brother out. And if you are Peter, Thomas, Cindy, Nicholas, or Jacob who just joined the community, thank you. All right, here's the man, Dr. Hall. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and we have a conversation today with the one and only Douglas John Hall. He is the emeritus professor of Christian theology at McGill University, and he is one of the pioneers of the theology of the cross, one of the people who have thought about what does theology look like in the North American context, and someone who, even though he just turned 86, can't quit publishing because he has more bits of goodness to share. So thank you, Dr. Hall, for joining the podcast today.
With pleasure.
So let's begin with giving just a little bit of your own personal story of faith and how that story of faith connected to your academic journey, because you've been an accomplished theologian in the academic side, but also someone who sees the connection of the ivory tower and the communion table to be very tight. So can you tell us when it was that you kind of got this vocational calling to be a theologian of the church?
Well, that's a long story. Some of it is told in a book I wrote called Bound and Free, and some of it is told in another book I wrote called The Messenger. I didn't begin as an academic at all. In fact, my main vocational ambition was to become a musician. I wanted to write music. And with that in mind, I finally went to the Royal Conservatory in Toronto in 1948 when I was 20 years old. And it happened that when I was there, I was going to a congregation in downtown Toronto in a working class area, and I heard the most marvelous sermons. And it was these sermons, plus the influence of 2 or 3 other people, that made me think I should study theology. Because I didn't have a proper academic background for doing this. When I was admitted to university, the University of Western Ontario, I was admitted as an adult student for 1 year on probation. I had no idea that I had any academic capabilities. And I was utterly surprised when at the end of that year, I got all A's. So I just stayed on then in university and graduate school for 11 years. I was at Union Theological Seminary from 1953, that's the one in New York, 1953 till 1960, 7 years. There was no other place to bother going in those days. Was anybody was either there or they came visiting there. Buber and all kinds of people were there. And I thought at that time that I would simply go on then to become ordained and be a minister. But my teachers at Union, including Paul Scherer and Dr. Niebuhr and others, convinced me that I should really prepare for academic work, and I did that. I was only a minister then for parish minister for 2 years, which I loved, actually, in a small town at the top of Lake Huron. But then the church asked me to take over the leadership of a new experimental college in a big new university in southern Ontario. And from there, I went to Saskatchewan for 10 years to teach at the St. Andrew's Theological College in the University of Saskatchewan. And I loved that too. And then I was asked to come to McGill in 1975 to be professor of Christian theology. I suppose always, ever since I began to think about Christianity seriously, I have felt that one should try to understand it, not just be a Christian. Of course, one should try to be a Christian, in terms of one's lifestyle and all that. But one should also try to understand it. I believe firmly in Anselm's dictum, fides quaerens intellectum. This means faith, if it's really faith and not just religious thought, drives one to understanding. Not in a gentle way. I mean, if you believe, there's a kind of urge in faith itself to try to comprehend. I've been trying to comprehend now for all these years. Since my 20th year, I've been trying to comprehend it quite a few years. I know perfectly well that I don't comprehend. I mean, at my age, I still feel I don't understand. And I'm not saying that just to be modest, but because I have really tried to understand. I've written something like 24 books trying to say to myself and to others what I really believe. But I agree with St. Augustine, who said these wonderful words, which I think should be over the door of every seminary. Si comprehendes, non est Deus. If you think you comprehend, It's not God you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And now, of course, it's one thing, you can't really get away with saying that. As a freshman in seminary, really tried it. But if at the age of 86 you say that and really mean it, what you mean is that that you're trying to understand God and the things of God and the world, that this subject matter that you're trying to understand is so much beyond you as a human being. It's such a mystery that you can only talk around it. You can say, as I did in my last book, you can say what it is not, but you can't really say very well ever what it is. Karl Barth understood that when he said at the very beginning of his book, Evangelical Theology, which for him as a German did not mean evangelicalism, but meant the Protestant church. Mm-hmm. And these were lectures that he gave in Chicago. And he began by saying, evangelical theology is the most modest science. It is modest not because it's virtuous, but because the object of its search is no object, but a living subject. And therefore, when we can't even say who our wives are, or our husbands, or our children, can you really put your wife down on paper in a doctrinal form? This is who my wife is, and so on. If we can't even say about our own people we know best who they are fully, in a fully satisfactory way, how can we expect to say who God is and what God intends for us and what? So there's a kind of modesty built into Christian theology, and I feel that it's deeply flawed in the churches today because there are so many people who know so much about God and everything, this kind of omniscience that we can hear on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, on American radio and television stations. This is to me a scandal, because the people who really know something about God and about humanity, about life, are more modest about it. Mm-hmm. Whether that means a scientist, a really good scientist, or philosophers, or anybody else.
When you give the kind of analogy to a human person and say your partner, like my wife and I have known each other for 15 years, been married over 10 now, and yet, like, part of her being a subject and not an object is she remains a mystery. And John Cobb, you used the line once. He said, the scriptures testify to a God who is a subject and who acts, and so speaks, and part of the problem in theology is so often, we turn God into an object and doctrines and these kinds of things to grasp. But I think the other temptation is for those that just say mystery so much that then the answer, when they try to answer the question, what is the gospel? It's so abstract that it's not even framed in a particularly Christian way. And in your new book, Waiting for the Gospel, the way you nuance both the mystery of the gospel and the meaning of the gospel, I think opens up a framing for that question that's distinctively Christian without it turning into kind of an absolutism or a relativism. So I'd love for you to describe to us, how is it that you start to think, talk, speak gospel?
Well, there are two aspects in the theological life, the life of the thinking Christian. One is our connection with the tradition. We are the inheritors of a long, long tradition. I always told my students who were beginning theology, please listen. You have come into a room where a conversation has been going on for 2,000, nay, 4,000 years. Please listen before you start contributing to the conversation. So, on the one side, we have to spend a lot of time dealing with the tradition, with what has been handed over to us in all of its variety, sometimes its contradictions, its dialectic. I was very fortunate that when I came to McGill University in 1975, I was suddenly told that I had to teach not only systematic theology, but the history of Christian thought to undergraduates. And so every year I had to go through the entire 2,000 years of the main figures and developers of Christian thought. I think this is a really important thing for a theologian, because we are not just making this stuff up out of our own intellect. We have to become students of Scripture, first of all, and students of the tradition of Augustine and Aquinas, and Luther and Calvin and Kierkegaard and Barth and Tillich and Hildegard and all those people. We have to really become involved with them. But we have that body of discussion in one hand, and in the other hand, we have the present time, our own context. One of the things that theological students, I find, have to learn is what time it is. What time it is now. What sort of a time is this? What is happening? Not just the questions people ask, but the questions underneath the questions. We have to get to know what time it is. I used to try to do this in my theological classes with beginners in theology by putting novels, evocative novels, beside each of the main doctrinal areas of theology. So, for instance, opposite epistemology, revelation and reason, and all that thing, I caused the students to read Jean-Paul Sartre's terrible book, Nausea, which raises the question of whether we know anything, and so there are these two things we have to keep in mind. The tradition that has been handed to us in the Scriptures and in the great minds of our past, and then our own present time. Now, if you're really in the midst of that kind of dialogue, if that kind of dialogue is going on within you, it could be a matter of suffering for you. And I think that theology involves suffering. I think that faith involves suffering. There's more about suffering, the suffering of the church in the New Testament, than there is about any other single ecclesiastical mark. Martin Luther, who is my great saint from the past, used to say that of all the marks, the 5 marks of the church, one holy, Catholic, apostolic, and so forth, the only mark that is really vital is the mark of the Holy Cross. You must ask about a community of faith, not just whether it has unity and holiness and apostolicity, but you must ask, does it suffer? Is it in its identification with the tradition and with its world? Is there some kind of cross involved in this? Or is it all just very nice and, we discuss it over tea? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that your emphasis on a theology of the cross is something that ties theology to the actual story of Jesus, that central image, the gospel that Paul continued to proclaim, Christ crucified. And you also inherit that tradition all the way from the New Testament through Luther and Bonhoeffer to address our particular situation today.
and that you had published on the theology of the cross before Moltmann had, and so.
Well, let's say simultaneously.
Moltmann, you're very humble.
I know Moltmann quite well. We've been friends for, I guess, since 1972. And Moltmann's thought, in fact, is very important in my development because his theology of hope came out when I was just beginning to teach theology. And I noticed what was done with this theology in the North American context. This is where I really discovered the importance of contextuality. Because in our context, we like the idea of hope. Oh, yes, we're very hopeful. We like all positive things, So we quickly took the theology of hope and turned it into another way of talking about the North American optimism. I mean, the first theological paper I wrote, I called The Theology of Hope in the Officially Optimistic Society. Mm-hmm. And, we took hold of Moltmann's thought, and Moltmann developed that thought as a prisoner in England. He was a German soldier who was imprisoned in England, and he had, like many of my friends of that age, he had to come to terms with the fact that his nation was a rogue nation, that it had created great difficulty in the world, and a lot of it under the name of its Christianity. He had to come to terms with that. So Moltmann wrote to me when he got a copy of my essay, Theology of Hope in an Officially Optimistic Society, and he was very interested in this. He said, come to see me. And so when I went to Germany to study, or on my sabbatical leave, I went to see him. And I said, yes, you see what's happening to your theology in the North American situation. It's being turned into another sort of gospel of success and optimism. And he said, yes, I know. And therefore, he said, I'm writing another book right now, and it's called The Crucified God. You see where I'm getting? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, for Moltmann, the theology of hope was something that emerged out of the theology of the cross. But, the theology of the cross has never been popular anywhere, as Moltmann said in that book, The Crucified God. There's much justification for it in Scripture and elsewhere, but it has never been much loved. And why? Well, because the church didn't want to have that kind of message. It seemed too negative. After all, the church got bound up very quickly in its history with a huge empire, the Roman Empire. And the empires don't like to have messages that draw attention to the problems. And the theology of the cross does. Because the theology of the cross is not just about Jesus. It's about the human situation. It's the cross of humanity, the cross of people. And Jesus is the one we associate with because he himself identifies in solidarity with human suffering. Mm-hmm. But Luther was quite right when he made the distinction between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. That distinction he introduced in 1518 in his Heidelberg Disputation, where he says in the 21st thesis there, the theology of glory calls evil good and good evil. The theology of the cross calls the thing what it really is. Mm-hmm. And in other words, the theology of the cross is a triumphalism, an ideological triumphalism, which has to lie about the world. It can't really say, look, these people are suffering. These Jews are being sent to Auschwitz. It can't really say that kind of thing because it wants to uphold a very triumphant image of its faith. Ideology is always like that. Religion is always like that. One thing that really has exercised me of late is the way in which in the earlier part of the 20th century, the great theologians, the great neo-Orthodox theologians, Bonhoeffer and Barth and Tillich and the others, all of them made a tremendous distinction between religion and faith. Religion is always reaching up to grasp something, grasp at God. The Tower of Babel, let's get in touch with the controller and we'll try to control the controller. Whereas Bonhoeffer said, no, faith is Pentecost, not Babel. It's God reaching down and respond and causing fire, causing us to think, causing us to change, and so on. And I think the theology of the cross has never been much loved, as Moltmann rightly said in The Crucified God, because the religion, Christendom, has been a very triumphalistic for the faith.
Yeah. So
I'm talking too much.
I think it's been great, and I would love for you to spell out some of the consequences of the theology of the cross, especially as it played out in the 20th century, because people used the theology of the cross to address questions that were raised after Auschwitz, the question of evil and theodicy. The cross has been raised as a way of understanding divine power, in kind of rejecting omnipotence. Theology of the cross is questioned theology's understanding of divine perfection, that God can't change or suffer. Can you kind of spell that out and connect it to where it was that you understand the cross, or how do you see the cross playing out in those different conversations about evil, divine power, and suffering?
Well, I am not a follower of St. Anselm on this subject. I think the Anselmic theology of atonement has done a great deal of disservice to the gospel. You know what I'm talking about? The theology in which Jesus is God's offering up to make up for the evil and sin of the human race. It's a sacrificial theory of. I think there's sacrifice involved, but it's God's sacrifice for us and with us, not a sacrifice to bring us to the knowledge of our guilt. I don't think, Tillich made a distinction between three different types of anxiety. To be human is to be anxious. But there are different kinds of anxiety, and he named three, which I think are quite right. The anxiety of fate and death, the anxiety of guilt and condemnation, and the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness. And he said, while these anxieties are always present in the human condition, one or other dominates a particular period. And if we're thinking contextually, then we must say that what dominates the period, the epoch of which we are part, is the latter, the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness. Is there any meaning in this whole process? Is history just a tale told by an idiot signifying nothing, as Shakespeare said? But on the whole, the Christian church was so bowled over by Anselm's Cor Deus Homo and that kind of thinking about the meaning of the cross, that it continued believing that the great problem of humankind is the anxiety of guilt. I don't know what your experience is of the world and the people, but I don't find a lot of guilt consciousness in most people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what really makes most of us anxious is the question of whether this process in which we're involved, this strange creaturely process, is going anywhere. Is there any meaning? Is there any purpose in it that we can we can define. Most of the great novels and plays and music also of our period and art have been preoccupied with the question, with the anxiety of meaning. And because we have been stuck with this anselmic theology, this Latin theory of the meaning of the cross, we have not been able very well to speak to the anxiety of our own context, our own epoch. I mean, and another thing is the church has to get inside the anxiety of its context. It can't just look at it from above, in some kind of transcendent way that, well, we know what the question is, but we also know what the answer is, You have to get inside the anxiety that you're trying to address. And that's very difficult. People go to church not to get inside their anxieties, but to lose them.
Yeah.
And therefore we present ourselves, we present the Christian faith as a way to overcome all your problems. Instead of trying to understand your problems, to understand the problems of the Isaiah, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. That's hardly going to church in order to get rid of your problems. The purpose of faith is to give us a sufficient amount of confidence, not certitude, but confidence, that we can enter as deeply as possible into the negativities that we ourselves feel. I always said to my students, what must you repress in order to believe what you believe as Christians? What must you repress and suppress? And the answer should be, the one you should strive for is nothing. There's nothing that I have to lie about in order to believe what I believe. That's the theology of the cross.
Yeah. One of the things that this makes me think of, especially for those that are listening that are ministers, is how a conversation about the gospel, when it's been narrowed to this kind of sin management system in light of Anselm, is that for mainline Protestants, it's like, yeah, we don't like penal substitutionary atonement. And so we ended up kind of going off track and just talking about social ethics, and that kind of stuff. When I think what you're saying is, the gospel's actually a lot bigger. It's more beautiful than just the character Anselm gave it. And I've had a conversation with ministers, and one of them asked a question that I found out was surprisingly in the minds of many. He said, I just can't get myself up to try to convince people that they're sinners. He said, when I grew up, in the rural south of North Carolina, that's where he's from. So when I grew up, I knew everyone was a sinner. They'd done wrong things and that guilt was a big deal and we had to be forgiven. He said, but my congregation, that's not even on their radar. So before I can even tell them the gospel, it's like I have to get them to go back in time and share this anxiety. And so I think that this conversation about the gospel is really important, and you've pointed it out as being important for the future of mainline Protestants in North America, because we need to be able to articulate the gospel in an open and loving and life-giving way that doesn't require us to convince someone they have a problem before they can hear it as good news.
And doesn't require us to put on smiling faces as we enter the church door. I once had an idea that an interesting play would be to show people going into church, and somebody would be standing at the door of the church, and there'd be a big barrel there, and each one would reach into the barrel and get out a happy face and put it on, because they knew that was the kind of face they should have in church. So church has not become a place where one can really think deeply about one's sin and so forth. But I say to your friend, to begin with, he's got a very bad understanding of the concept of sin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no word in the English language is worse understood, although there's a lot of misunderstanding. But, I mean, sin is surely one of the worst and the most badly understood words in the Christian vocabulary, because people think of it as bad deeds, bad thoughts, and especially related to sexuality. I have these nasty thoughts, and when I did these nasty things. I mean, sin is not about that at all. It's about alienation. It's about estrangement. It's about a sense of being separated from something that you should be connected with. It's a sense of the emptiness of one's life and of lack of partnership, of love on the other side.
Mm-hmm. You had two books that you had. One was about thinking the faith, and the other was about confessing the faith. Could you describe the need for both and the difference between the two?
Yes, well, you got it a little bit wrong.
Sorry,
it was a trilogy, not just two, but three. The first this was my attempt at a systematic theology, but I called it a contextual theology because I wanted it to be not just doctrine, but how does the tradition, how does the gospel meet the present time? Barth said the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. That was his way of saying we live between the tradition and the present context. Now, when I wrote the trilogy, that's my big work, really. It's three big volumes. And the first one I call Thinking the Faith. What does it mean in the first place to think about this tradition? What's involved in thinking about it? This is, in other words, the whole epistemological side of faith, revelation, reason, and all of that. And what does it mean to think this faith? Not just to have faith, but to think about it. And then, what is it that faith professes? When you profess the faith, what is it exactly that you profess? And that's where I look at the content of theology, so to speak. But finally, a profession, if it stays at the level of profession, it has not really been faith, because faith manifests itself in works. Mm-hmm. Luther was not against works. He was against supposing that works rather than faith justified one. But so the third of that series I called confessing the faith. Thinking, professing, confessing. Now, the great statement that lies behind those three volumes, I was bowled over once when I was a young teacher of theology by quotation from Martin Luther, which goes something like this. If I profess every word of the Christian faith, except that one little word that is needed then and there, then I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing him. For the soldier to be brave on all the battlefield, besides, except at that one little point where the battle is raging, then he's lost. He's no longer a useful soldier. So part of the task of theology, that's why I said before about the necessity of trying to figure out what's going on in our own time, the question beneath the questions. Part of the task is to figure out where the battle is raging. So, but I broke this down, and I used that quotation as a sort of basis for my arrangement of my understanding of the Christian faith, thinking it, professing it, and confessing it.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people today have the same kind of inklings you do about the situation of the church in North America, and especially how kind of the mainline Protestants understand the faith, how they share it, how they embody it. And there's a number of particular questions that end up causing hesitancy, and you have addressed them in your work in different places. And one of them really is how, as Protestants in a culture in North America so shaped in a sense by conservative evangelicals' relationship to Scripture, how is it that we understand Scripture and its place in the church and theology?
Well, I don't believe in the Bible. I believe in God. I mean, Reinhold Niebuhr was right when he said that Protestantism fought the papacy using the Bible, and then they turned around and used the Bible as a paper pope. The Bible is not this kind of thing that we... Well, let me tell you a story. I was in Union Seminary as a student when Billy Graham came to preach in James Chapel, the main chapel of the seminary. And I saw Billy Graham standing there. He was rather nervous being at the center of Christian liberalism, I think. But he said, I know this is right. I've got it right here in the Bible. And though I was only a beginner in theology, I knew what were the most important words in that statement. And they were, I've got it. I've got it right here in the Bible. This is now something that I've got. But the Word of God is not something that you get or have. It's something you hear. And you've got to hear it again and again. And, I mean, that's why we have to fight this kind of Christianity that is based on what it thinks is biblical thought, although it doesn't really know the Bible, actually. And it gives people such a sense of certitude. I've got it, you know. I'm reading a book here right now that was brought to me. Make just a little detour. Recently, I had a call from the Synod of Nebraska, the Lutheran Synod of Nebraska, and they asked me if I'd come and give some lectures in Omaha. And I said, well, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm too old to travel and all that. And they said, well, can we come there? Can some of us come to you? So four excellent Lutheran clergy, 3 men and a woman, came to Montreal, rented a house for a week, and we had seminars, 4 long seminars. It was wonderful. And one of them, when they left, they gave me some books and so on. And one of the books they gave me is called The Brothers. And The Brothers is a book by Stephen Kinzer, who's a journalist and a scholar, worked for the New York Times and others. And the brothers in question are the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA. These 2 brothers were brought up in a Presbyterian manse. They were very, very, very Presbyterian, at least in their understanding of Presbyterian. They were with this kind. It was that kind of Calvinist where you had Calvinism where a great deal of certainty. You knew right from wrong, and you knew, for instance, if you were John Foster Dulles, that communism was wrong and that America was right. He spent his life fighting communism. Now, I just wanted to tell you that the inscription that they made, these guys from Nebraska made in the book they gave me, which is about, it's a 2013 book. The inscription goes like this. Here is the story of the menace of Christendom writ large. This is how this story of the Dulles brothers was a story of the menace of Christendom writ large. And I think that's really true. My teacher, Reinhold Niebuhr, had to quarrel with John Foster Dulles because he said, Mr. Dulles' world is too cut and dried. You see, it's this kind of certitude which comes from a certain kind of biblicism, a certain kind of doctrinalism, maybe a Calvinist doctrinalism, or it could be coming from other traditions. But faith is not certitude. Faith is confidence, but not certitude.
Mm-hmm. Well, in addressing a number of those issues, one of your other new books is called What Christianity Is Not, an exercise in negative theology. Can you maybe tell us the story of where this book came from? Because in it, you address all sorts of kind of the contemporary questions. Christianity is not a culture, religion of the book, a doctrine, a moral system, the truth. But what is it about negative theology that made you, want to address these contemporary issues in that form?
Well, what made me want to address them is that I have 8 grandchildren to whom I dedicated this book. I have 4 children, and I wanted the Christian faith that they encounter still to have some kind of authenticity in it, something they didn't have to talk down to. I mean, and their mother and I have represented to them, the grandmother and I, have represented to them a certain kind of faith which we hope is a thinking faith, a faith which is able to doubt and not simply to come out with all kinds of certainties based on the Bible, based on Calvinist doctrine or something like that. And I think the kind of Christianity that we have in North America, and particularly in the United States of America, it's rather different in Canada in that respect. We're much more European in that respect than you are. But the kind of Christianity that you have, especially in the States, is something that my children and grandchildren are simply not interested in. They're not interested in it when they hear about the television. They're just not interested in it. Now, Christianity should be interesting, at least. It should be at least as interesting as Plato or Aristotle or existentialism or communism. I mean, it should be interesting. And instead, what has happened is that Christianity has been taken over by certain, let's say, how could I say, certain aspects of the faith have been turned into absolutes. Mm-hmm. For instance, the Bible, instead of being a witness to God's word, becomes God's word, literally, in the King James Version. This is ridiculous. Now, the Western Church, both in its Catholic and its Protestant phases, has not very much liked the tradition of negative theology or apophatic theology. That is what I'm doing in my last book, which is my last book, by the way. Mm-hmm. What Christianity is not, an exercise in negative theology. The Western Church has not been much interested in the apophatic tradition. The East has been much more interested in it, partly because the East understood that at the center of the faith there is great mystery, and you can't go on boasting as if you really understood this mystery. As Augustine said, si comprehendes, non est Deus. The Western Church was a powerful church, whether in its Roman expression, which was, of course, the greatest one, or in its state church, or state Protestant churches of Europe. And these kinds of entities, these kinds of institutions do not want to have apophatic, they want cataphatic theology. That is, they want affirmative theology. This is what we believe. This is what we believe. Write it down, class, and believe it, every word, This is affirmative theology. Whereas if it's true that, as Bart said, Christian theology is the most modest science. It's modest because its object is no object but a living subject. And this is true. Then you can't just go around saying that this is what we believe. You can't put it down in creedal form and say that's it, because you do some kind of injustice to the living reality of God. So that negative theology can try to preserve the mystery at the core of the faith, while at the same time showing the importance of the things that uphold this mystery, like the Bible and so on. So even though I've written that book as an exercise in negative theology, as the best reviewers of the book have realized, it's also a book about a positive statement about what Christian theology is.
Yes.
But I feel that Christianity is so badly abused on this continent that one has to name the abuses. And that's what I've tried to do in that book.
So if you were sitting down with a group of young Christians and they're like, Christianity is boring, but they don't have time to read the whole book, what kind of things would you just insist in kind of the short, snappy sentences, saying, look, this is not Christianity?
Well, I think there would be a strong sense of the mystery, without turning it into simply, well, it's all a mystery sort of thing. There's abstract mysticism and there's concrete mysticism. So I think I would, instead of trying to answer their question, I'd tell them a story, or I'd read a story to them. For instance, I would read that story with which I ended the book, What Christianity is Not, the story by the Japanese author Shusaku Endo. Do you know that book?
I only know the reference from the book.
Well, please read Endo's work. It's one of the most profound works of theology that I've ever read. And I would tell that story to the young people, or some story like it. It's an interesting thing that the most interesting expressions of the theology of the cross artistically, in terms of, especially of novels, have come from the Catholic side, like The Power and Glory of Graham Greene, Shusaku Endo. I mean, the dramatic element needs to be in it. So if I was sitting with young people, I would not, to begin with, start quoting from my book or from any other book. I would say, let's listen to this story. Let's read this story together. Let's go to that movie together. Let's look at George Banano's The Diary of a Country Priest. A story in which losers turn out to be, in some strange way, winners because they discover truth. They discover acceptance. They discover compassion. Yeah.
How has your career as a theologian impacted your own practices of piety, prayer, church participation, and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah. Well, like many of my contemporaries, I started out being very keen on church, on going to church, on prayer, and all kinds of things related to the practice of the faith as it has been in the tradition. And like many of my contemporaries, I've been disillusioned by all of that. my lot of that, not all of it. When I discover it in authentic form, I still understand it. But for the most part, the church, in our situation at least, is not convincing. In a way, my church now extends around the world. I'm very grateful for email, for example, that I can be in touch with people who seem to understand this and who share. We can share in that way. But so much of the church today is a very confused and confusing thing. This is partly because we are in the midst of an enormous transition. The transition from Christendom to something else. We don't know what this something else is. One of my doctoral students suggested to me, perhaps we're in for another monastic period, a period when we should go simply try to preserve the faith in quietness. Because Christendom has just this phenomenon of imperial Christianity has poisoned the church in some way. Mm-hmm. It's given us the impression that to be Christian, you have to be big to begin with. The Crystal Cathedral or something like that. You have to be big, but and successful, and there should be lots of people, lots of young people. Get the young people into the church, and so on. And we're very confused because Christendom has given us this kind of model of the church, but it's not the New Testament model. In fact, the New Testament model is more like, where two or three are gathered together, there I am in the midst of you. Jesus' metaphors for the church are all metaphors of littleness, salt, yeast, light. A city set on a hill, but not Los Angeles. A city on a little city with little oil lamps. And these are all, and the thing that these small things that do is that they're there to do something for the big thing. A yeast so that the dough will rise. Light so that the darkness will have some guidance to this wandering about in it. And yes, well, I think you get it.
Well, so how does this a lot of these kind of critiques or things we see kind of in Bonhoeffer's prison writings, things about the church, and I think a lot of people come to share this frustration that the church's attachment to privilege and power and its position in culture, where it's culture dominant, and those kinds of things have really infected the church. But the people that fall in love with God, revealed in Christ, often have fallen in love with God through the church. And so their calling to be a minister, to be a part of the community and stuff is a tenuous one, because you fall in love and come to understand that the place you met God is part of the problem. So how is it that you kind of help younger people understand what to do with their calling and desire to create communities and negotiate the relationship to the systems that are passing away?
Well, I think I'm not young, and therefore I can't answer that in really concrete ways. But I think if I were young, I would try to go where the young people are and not try to get them into the church. I would go where they are. I would say, hey, there's a great film on that we should go and see and then talk about, let's look at this art. There's a big exhibit down there in the Beaux-Arts Museum right now on Impressionism. Let's go and look at that and talk about it. I know that young people still ask questions, but it's increasingly difficult, I think, for them to ask the real questions in situations of formal worship and so on.
Mm-hmm. You have to read this book by them?
Oh, Oh dear, when you start asking about books, I've got several books right here in front of me. For example, I would tell them to read Karl Rahner, the greatest Catholic theologian of our epoch. Karl Rahner, Mission and Grace. Well, listen to this statement. My thesis is this: insofar as our outlook is really based on today and looking towards tomorrow, the present situation of Christians can be characterized as that of a diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
A diaspora. So, I mean, yes, I would tell them to read I and Thou, Buber. I would tell them to read Karl Barth's Dogmatics. I would tell them to read Tillich's The Courage to Be. One of the beefs that I have about theology in the, let's say, after 1960, Christian theology became so interested in certain issues and identities that we forgot to ask and try to answer comprehensive questions. So it became a matter of a theology of this or a theology of that, you know. We got interested in black theology and in women's theology, and all of these things are really important. But we still have to address the great questions of humanity, and not just specific questions of identity and cause and so on. So I'm afraid I would not be too easy on people who ask me that question. I would say, well, there has been wonderful writing of theology all through the 20th century and into the 21st, but please go and read some of these great theologians.
What about Kierkegaard? In your book, Waiting for the Gospel, the last chapter is brilliant. A Latter-day Kierkegaardian attends a megachurch.
Yes. Well, I did that for fun, but I think it does say some things.
Definitely. So
I mean, I just thought that whole performance that was in Atlanta. Actually, I was at a church. I could hardly believe what was happening in front of me. Because, I mean, for one, you have to understand as an American that we Canadians are much more secular. We are a very secular people. I mean, you know, in this city of Montreal, which until about 1960 was one of the most Catholic cities in the world, there are something like 52 big Roman Catholic churches for sale. So, I mean, the secular reality causes us to think not just about how theology would speak to this or that issue or this or that cause, but what it's all about. What is the message of what is gospel for now?
So you mentioned at the beginning having been a musician at first, and you know Karl Barth has a kind of there's a story about him discussing what angels listen to.
Mozart. He was a great fan of Mozart, and he wrote an essay and a letter to Mozart in which he said when the angels play before God, they play Bach, but when they're by themselves, they play Mozart, and then God will be happy to listen in. Yes, well, I love Mozart too, but I also love Rachmaninoff, and I love Tchaikovsky. I love the Romantics. They were already sensing, you know, the kind of turmoil and confusion of life in the 20th and 21st century. And the life of Tchaikovsky is a parable for our times. You know, a man who probably took his own life because they were threatening to expose him as a gay. I think we have to use whatever talent we have to try to understand what we mean by gospel. And for Barth, it was Mozart. For Paul Tillich, it was modern art. and I have found both art and music to be a very good place to try to understand the time, what time it is.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, as I said at the beginning, is one of the two things that you have to try to understand if you want to think theologically.
Yeah.
What the tradition is and what time it is now.
Mm-hmm. Today, when the institutions of the church are fighting, they tend to be fighting and trying to address a couple issues like the inclusion of gay, lesbian, transgendered, bisexual people in the church, and then the other big thing we end up arguing over is the church's relationship to all of creation, in recognizing and responding to the ecological crisis.
Yes.
How do you frame those theologically so that when we talk about them, we don't talk about them in the same way with the same dividing lines and energy and oversight and overlooks that culture does?
Well, I've been working with those particular questions for a long time. I mean, since at least 1960, like Joseph Sittler, Wildfire, I've been working with the environmental question. I wrote 3 books on the theology of stewardship because I think the biblical metaphor of the steward is a way of thinking about what is the role of humanity in the natural order. On the question of sexuality, I addressed this question in a book called The Messenger, which I mentioned earlier in our conversation, which is kind of autobiographical. I think, you see, on the whole question of sexuality, I'm getting all bound up with the question whether we should ordain gay people and so on. I think we've got our priority really wrong. Why should sexuality be, in the first place, at the top of the list of human attributes? Mm-hmm. Sex has sort of taken over. The ancients thought that the essence of humanity, well, with Aristotle, man is a rational animal. The Hebrews thought man is a relational animal. I mean, the human being is a relational animal. We seem to have decided that human being is a sexual animal. And so we've got our priorities wrong in the first place. And this prioritizing comes down to little nitty-gritty questions, I would say, like, should we ordain gay people? I would want to say, hell, we've always been ordaining gay people ever since St. Paul, you know. It's ridiculous, this kind of fixation on sex. I mean, the question shouldn't be, should there be a fair portion of women in the ministry? Should there be a fair portion of gay and lesbian people in the ministry? And the question should be, what are these people like, and what are they talking about? What is the nature of the truth as they understand it? Questions of substance, not questions of identity.
Mm-hmm. So, in a sense, the problem is just having a really bad theological anthropology. Oh,
yes, sure. But I don't quite know what you mean by that, so you tell me.
Oh, that when we go to ask the question about the participation of gay and lesbians in the church, part of the problem you pointed out is that we're so obsessed with human beings as sexual beings, and that's a very small part of what it means to be human. But if you have a bad anthropology, that's what is really important, then you end up answering the question poorly.
That's for sure. I mean, it's part of the whole dichotomy that we've created between the body and the spirit.
Mm-hmm. So, last question is, what is a question that you think is really important that you don't know the answer to?
Oh, dear. I suppose it's Bonhoeffer's question, really. If I come right down to the most existential thing for me, the question is, the one that Bonhoeffer asked in his poem, "Who am I? Who am I?" I think this has to be everybody's. If people think deeply, they ask this question. I have a little grandson who lives in Vienna, whose parents are musicians, and he and his mother sit in the bathtub and have philosophic conversations. He's 6 years old, and he said to her the other day, "You know, Mom, I've been thinking. I found myself thinking. I don't quite know how to say it, but I found myself thinking, who am I? Who am I really?" And I said, well, that was Aristotle's question of Plato's, and the question of Jesus too, and the question of people around Jesus wanted to know who he was. And so the question of who we are, of where we're going, of what is the intention of our humanity, this is a question that is universal, I think. Mm-hmm. Question too. And as I reach the end of my journey, I'm quite conscious of this question. Where have I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of this story? This is my life. And so on. Mm-hmm. So, I think if we can ask these questions about our own being, we're much more trustworthy with answers to the question, to the big ethical and other questions of the being of the whole.
Mm-hmm. Man, thank you. That was, I have so much enjoyed talking to you. It's a real honor and a treat.